I do not think people realize how the United States would be if SpaceX did not exist. Like, we just killed the space shuttle. It's like Lockheed and Boeing were doing nothing new at all. China has been pumping just billions of dollars. People would be freaking out.
All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Ashlee here with me. Ashlee's got a brand new book out, When the Heavens Went on Sale, The Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. I've read the entire thing. It's absolutely fantastic. It is a great space book follow-up to his book on Elon Musk. And I thought that'd be a great place for us to start this conversation, is on Elon himself. Obviously, Elon is incredibly obsessed with getting to Mars. As you followed him to write the original book, and now you've continued to kind of pay attention to what SpaceX and Elon has done, what's changed? Is there changes to the mission? Is there changes to Elon personally? What are you seeing as the years go on?
Yeah, the big mission is still there. He is obsessed with setting up this human colony on Mars. He's always thought humans need a backup plan. SpaceX's business itself has kind of changed in some ways. He always said, it was meant to be sort of build a business to get to Mars. And I guess that holds true still. But, he used to say he's not a moon person. Now SpaceX is doing missions to the moon. Starlink, the space internet system, is like this massive part of the business that kind of just arrived in the last few years. And that's really, if you look at SpaceX's valuation, there's almost like no money in actually launching rockets, even when you do it SpaceX style, which is pretty cheap and fast. All the money's in satellites, data, communication. So SpaceX's value is like totally tied up in Starlink. I think there's like all this added complexity in business to the mission. But at the same time, it's hard to, like, if you don't follow space super close, it is like hard to convey how far ahead. This is like not SpaceX fanboy talk. This is just legit. I mean, they're so far ahead of the commercial space players, but then all the nations that have been doing this for decades. It's kind of the craziest business and tech story I can fathom. Then, beyond SpaceX, yes, Elon has changed and gotten more complicated and sort of let himself loose. I get a little sad. To me, Twitter seems like a big distraction. He seems super worried about AI. I always kind of thought he would slowly wind things down and just be doing SpaceX all the time.
When you look at SpaceX itself, you mentioned just how far ahead they are. To me, it's almost like the operating system of space now, right? Is everyone's got to go through SpaceX for the most part. Now, in this book, you cover a bunch of startups that want to change that. They want to have smaller rockets or more, takeoffs and kind of all these different strategies. But is it still true that SpaceX really is, the big boy in the room? And if you want to go to space with a satellite or some sort of cargo, you're going on a SpaceX rocket?
Yeah, I mean, to a large degree, look, Europe has rockets, Russia has rockets, although, not many people can use them now. China, India, they can all get you to space, just not nearly as frequently as SpaceX can, and usually not as cheaply. Your point is right. I mean, there's dozens of rocket companies, so people would kind of be like, why? I mean, SpaceX flies, there's different classes, right? There's kind of large, medium, and small rockets, and SpaceX is pretty dominant in the large part. There's a huge thesis, which I get into in gory detail in the book, that, look, we have about like 9,000 satellites orbiting the Earth now. That's been on an exponential increase the last 3 years. People think we're going to put up 100,000, 200,000 pretty quick. Not like nobody now produces enough rockets to make that happen. So if that becomes a reality, and it looks quite like it is going to, then we need a lot of rocket players, probably not dozens, but more. But SpaceX would still be the dominant player in that scenario. It's just that I think there's probably more business to go around. The other thing is just, like, if Starship works, it's such a the rocket is so massive that SpaceX would be taking like what we used to do for an entire year on one launch into orbit at a lower cost there's a lot between here and making that happen. But that's, anyway, things could get quite dramatic. It'll be interesting to see exactly how this all plays out.
So I want to talk about the companies that you cover in this book. And there were two things that I think kind of came together that seemed to be the drivers of this explosion of space startups. Now, SpaceX obviously started, more than 20 years ago at this point, and they've been at this a long time. But one of the things was this guy, Pete Worden, who you cover, almost all throughout the entire book. Talk a little bit about Pete, his role at NASA, this idea that he kind of was the misfit of NASA, but he even has this quote in the book where he's like, in times of war, you need different people who kind of think outside the box than during times of peace. And he was that guy. So kind of talk about this guy, maybe his importance to this explosion of startups going to space.
Yeah, I think he gives some of the best quotes. I think he says something like, in times of war, sometimes you need, break glass for crazy, and he was kind of the great crazy general. I mean, before Elon, so Pete Warden's a bit older. He's probably close to his 70s now. He was like an astrophysicist by training. He had a PhD. He ended up in the Air Force, became a general. Hardly anybody knows about him, but he's like this figure that's been lurking back as like kind of a puppet master all this time. He worked on the Star Wars missile defense shield during the Reagan era. He did a bunch of black ops stuff that he can't talk about. But yeah, he ends up at NASA Ames, which is like the Silicon Valley NASA center. He's the director there in kind of like the early 2000s. And, Pete for decades have been writing papers like, God, the government needs to get out of its own way. We need to make cheap rockets. We need to send them up all the time. We need to make cheap satellites. We have to piggyback on Moore's law and what's been happening in consumer electronics. But NASA and the military contractors were just sort of, allergic to any of these new ideas. But Pete assembles like this team of 20-somethings at NASA Ames, like his little dream team of space weirdos to go make some of these ideas happen. He had to like literally kind of hide them in closets to keep them away from senators and NASA headquarters officials who were going to shut down what they were doing. But he kind of makes this new era of commercial space happen. A lot of the startups in the book come right out at NASA Ames. And then Pete was the one who gave SpaceX, Elon was funding SpaceX, but when they wanted to fund their first mission through the Defense Department, Pete was the one who really kind of made that happen. And so, I see him and Elon as these two figures that have propelled all this forward.
So Pete obviously was this huge driving factor. You mentioned that he went and found all like the space weirdos and brought them together. And what I took away from the book is like, when we talk about weirdos, we're not just talking about like, oh, this person's not in NASA. We're talking about literally going and finding like the 20-year-old kid who wants to blow shit up, right? Or like get to space in some weird way. Yeah. It really was this like weird collection of people. Is that what it takes to kind of create something brand new that's so disruptive? Is like you have to go so much to the fringe of society and find these people with these wild ideas and maybe the naivety or the stupidity to like actually go after them? Like talk a little bit about that group that he had put together there at that facility.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There were a lot of people that he brought in. I call them Pete's kids, but there was kind of like this special group that were particularly close, probably about a dozen people. A ton of them lived in a commune called the Rainbow Mansion that I write about in the book. I think it's this combination of you've got these young kids with all these ideas and they're capable, but they've never manage some huge budget or had to put like structure around a project. And then Pete was like the wizened old veteran in the room who could kind of set that stuff up. And then he could also, it was really like the protection that he gave them, so he hands them the resources and usually this bureaucracy would come and just find its way to grind everything to a halt. But Pete was that unique person who was, he almost got fired like 18 times. I mean, he was willing to like sort of deal with a lot of crap and protect these people. So I think it's kind of this mix. I think in space, I don't know if the average person really realizes like how stuck in the mud space had become and had just not changed for like 30, 40 years. So yeah, I think you needed like all these clean slates, these people that had out there ideas. It's sort of like the kind of person that they're going to be told that this is dumb like 1,000 times, and they're still going to do it.
So the other kind of big trend, if you will, was this idea of taking consumer electronics and being able to shoot them into space. And I didn't understand, I think, that component of this explosion of space startups, where my understanding after reading the book is basically there was like space grade materials. And there were, you'd spend $10 million on something that now is available to consumers literally for a couple $100. And there was a period where people had the idea, could we take the consumer electronics and would it survive going to space? Could it be on a rocket, et cetera? And so there's the phone sat program and a bunch of this stuff, but talk maybe about that period of time of like, that kind of seems like a stupid idea, in hindsight of like how simple it is, but it does feel like maybe that was a really, really pivotal moment for space kind of exploration in general, that now consumer electronics and the lower price points could actually be used for this stuff.
It really was. Planet Labs, you mentioned this phone sat program. They literally they like bought a Google Nexus phone, or a few of them, and put them on a rocket and launched them into space to see if they would work. And they did. And that ended up being the basis of Planet Labs, this company that has all these imaging satellites. And I would argue SpaceX had this huge effect on the cost of rockets and access to space, but it was like that moment where people finally got Moore's law and modern technology to space and had this awakening. It's like this weird historical baggage where, space used to be really hard, so you wanted to make a super fancy radio that you knew could survive the launch and all the harsh conditions of space, and then time passed, and you probably didn't need that anymore, but there was some contractor in like Alabama that made the space grade radios, and everyone just bought them from them because they always worked. And so these were the first people who were like, I think a cell phone might work up there. Like space is really freaking cold. The temperatures like swing a lot. The rocket launch itself is really violent, but it turned out these phones worked fine. And so then everybody's minds expanded at that point, and they're like, there's been 40 years of turns of Moore's law and all this innovation, and now we can not only have cheaper stuff in space, but obviously it's going to be more modern technology. And just the last part on that is that the thinking around satellites used to be that you spend $1 billion and you send this huge thing up and it lasts for 20 years. Like, after 20 years pass, it's not a super modern bit of equipment. And so like, this was like a whole rethinking of, we should just make these satellites last for like 3 or 5 years and just swap them out all the time.
So this brings me to Peter Beck. And you talk about like this rocket bike, which I think gets back to this idea of kind of the space weirdos, right? It's the same person who would put like a jet engine on a bicycle and see how fast it could go. Same person who thinks that they can launch rockets into space. But there's also a focus on like doing it in New Zealand and not necessarily doing it in the United States. You mentioned in the book there was no infrastructure, there was no aerospace industry, there was no anything in New Zealand. And yet this guy who literally was spending his time putting, rocket engines on bicycles in his spare time decides he's going to go, instead of horizontal, he's going to go vertical. Like, how insane? Is there a way to describe like how crazy of an idea that was before it actually came to fruition?
I think it's like a 1 in 7 billion sort of situation. I went to New Zealand a bunch of times for this book. I mean, it's like as unique as SpaceX. It's just this weirder personal story in a lot of ways. Peter grew up in Invercargill, which I don't know if anyone's ever had the pleasure. It's a very nice city, but it's like at the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand. The next stop is Antarctica. It's like very rural. There's not much going on there, and this is like not a kid who was, on his way to like a scholarship at MIT or anything. I mean, he was very good with his hands, but he didn't even go to college. He was working at a dishwasher maker, an appliance maker, as like a apprentice. And like you said, so he was just obsessed with rockets, and he just likes to go fast. And so he has this house and he's got like a shed out back and he's making like his own propellants. He used to put garbage bags around his body to like protect himself from the propellants, and he made his own rocket engines, and he just got really far. I forget how long ago. It was like maybe 2006. He made this rocket called the Atya 1, and it was really just him and two part-time people, and it got to the edge of space as like basically a hobbyist project, and then turned that into a company. And man, New Zealand has nothing. I interviewed the prime minister who was running the country when Peter was doing all this, and he's like, "Look." Well, first of all, it was hilarious because the prime minister showed up in like a t-shirt and shorts and like offered to pick me up in his car and take me to brunch. But he's like, "Look, we've got like two tanks. We barely have like a ship, and this guy's coming in telling me we're going to space." I was kind of like, do we want to, get involved in that? That seems sort of big for us, and there's no talent to lean on. Nobody had ever done this before. And for people who don't know, Rocket Lab is like the second coming of SpaceX. I mean, SpaceX has launched hundreds of times. Rocket Lab's launched almost 40. And after that, you drop down to like one or two very quickly. And so I don't know, man. I do this for a living. I sort of chase weirdos around the world, and I've never met anyone like Peter.
What do you think makes them so different? Is it just the upbringing? Is it like literally growing up in New Zealand, literally kind of changes the way you think? Is it something about the family? Because I know that there was a lot of mechanics and things that they were doing on a day-to-day basis, tinkering and unpacking machines and things like that. Like what drove him to kind of end up in this very different place?
Part of it has to be the genes, because I sort of got super fascinated in his dad, who was like this expert in everything. He was like a master sculptor. He was like the world's leading authority on jade, and like worked at a museum. He built his own telescope for the museum that Peter used to sort of like help out with as a kid. And yeah, so they just had this garage. Peter had two brothers, and they just sat there tinkering on cars nonstop. And it was just like it was like this brotherly competition to see who could do more. But Peter, it's become clear to me over time, Peter is some kind of genius, because he built, after that first rocket, they built this rocket called Electron, which is their workhorse today. It's you can ask pretty much anyone. As far as small rockets go, it's like the perfectly engineered rocket. And yeah, Peter had a team of hundreds of people that helped him, but there were countless times where it just wasn't going to happen. They couldn't solve some problem. And I asked Peter about this sometimes. He's like, "Yeah, I would just go take a shower, and like this idea would come to me of how to fix this thing." He seems to have some like intuitive knowledge of like, he seems to be able to translate some intuitive knowledge of physics and the vision in his head, like very directly to his hands. If you ask anyone, Pete's down there with like a lathe and milling machine and making the stuff himself. So I don't know. Part of it's the culture, part of it's his genes, and then I think he's just like exceptional. He's also not like, he's possessed by having to make stuff, right? Like he made a rocket engine just because like he had to. He's not like Elon. He's not trying to make some colony on Mars. It was more just like, I want to see if I can make a rocket engine, and then I want to see if I can make a rocket, and then he just I think that's his calling, is the object itself.
Yeah, what's fascinating is each person in the stories that you tell in this book, they seem to have different drivers, right? And it goes back to, if you think of Elon, actually my wife has a theory, which I don't think we'll ever get kind of confirmation on. But when she read your book, she said, listen, it seems like Elon was kind of a great entrepreneur and he was going, but when his child passed away, he became possessed. He wanted to save humanity. He wanted to kind of go and it became this thing of like, I'm going to level up my ambition. I'm going to level up, the risk that I'm willing to take. And that was like a very pivotal moment. Did you find the same thing when you were actually spending time with him and writing that book?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to talk about, because Elon's always, his first child died of sudden infant death syndrome. And Elon's always kind of downplayed it, I mean, maybe for obvious reasons. He just doesn't want to talk about it. His ex-wife, though, used to sort of try to talk about it. And Elon would just say, look, what's the point of dwelling on this? I've just got to get to work. So, it's a hard thing. I did try a few times to kind of get into it, but it was like one of those areas I don't know. Elon's in a bit more of like, I would call it like a expressive state than when I was doing a lot of interviews for the book. I think some of those things he wasn't used to talking about. But I don't know. That's a good question. I never thought about it fully like that. He like SpaceX had already started then, but it was, and he'd always had this Mars idea in the back of his head. But at that point, it was more like to be the southwest of space, to be really cheap and more like the people in the book to like get stuff to space all the time, really cheap. You have to imagine, right, that something like that has a huge impact on you. And if there's like any defining quality of Elon, it's like this relentless sort of pursuit of making the most of your time that you have. And so if you're playing armchair psychologist, you could definitely see how that kind of would feed into something like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of think through, you've got Peter Beck, you've got Elon, and kind of what's driving those two guys. But then you get to somebody like Chris Kemp. And for those that don't know, in the book, basically he has a very similar drive and determination, and it seems like kind of will his way into doing things. And there's this now famous Alameda kind of campus or site, and it's abandoned. And he basically goes and he's trying to get the Alameda City Council and local leaders to like essentially give it to him, right? And be like, hey, like bring industry here from the Bay Area, right? Like come and build this out. And they're kind of like waffling, it seems. And he basically just moves in and just like starts like fixing it up. And on next thing you know, they're like, well, like, I guess we should just say yes, because he kind of is like doing what he said he was going to do. Is that what actually happened?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, so I was with Asterisk as like the first day they started, and man, this place was like a real shithole. It was like there's kind of two parts to it. There's two buildings that they've taken over, and one was this. It used to be a naval air base, and so during World War II, this was like a place where they did a lot of repairs to jet fighters, and the first building Astra had was like this very weird. They used to test jet engines inside so that like our enemies couldn't see what was going on or whatever, and so they have these huge like tunnels with like these 12-foot thick walls and these exhausts for all the fire. But like this place was full of like softball league paperwork, typewriters that had been in city. It was like a city dump, it was like all the stuff the city had just been burying there for years. There was like a dead dude who got electrocuted trying to grab the copper from some of the wirings. There was like a dead body in there. And, the city didn't know what to do with it. Part of it is like they thought it was like a hazardous. And exactly like you said, Chris is like, well, I know what to do with this, and so sometimes at night they would bash down like they would have to get stuff like a electric like a power subsystem into the building, and the door wasn't big enough, so they would like bash down an entire like wall of the building, put the electric subsystem in the middle of the night when nobody could see them, repair the whole wall, and just keep moving forward. And over time, this was a long process. Like they almost got kicked out a few times, like the fire marshals would show up and things like that. But yeah, over time, then the city walked in one day and they have like this glorious rocket factory in the middle of Alameda, which is a very like suburban city near Oakland. So Chris, I think had some of that Elon spirit. Similar things happened in the early SpaceX days as well.
Now, the other character that I want to talk about is Max Polyakov. How do you say his last name?
Polyakov.
All right. So he's fascinating, obviously. I think you call out in the book multiple times, like, I've never been around a person like this before. For those who are unfamiliar with him, he basically made a ton of money, unclear how much, in building internet companies in Europe. He's Ukrainian. Again, I say unclear because it's unclear how much money he made. It seems like it's unclear in terms of all of the different ways that he made the money. In some ways, people are like, look, he's got dating websites and things that, might not be for everyone, but it's understandable. And there's plenty of them here in the US. And then there's some people who accuse him of doing, maybe illegal things or close to it, potentially immoral things, whatever, but he ends up with a ton of money. He then starts to invest heavily in the space business. And basically, it sounds like the U.S. kind of railroaded them, right? They basically said, look, man, you've got this business, you've done all this work, you've invested all this capital, and right when the rocket's sitting on the launch pad and pretty much ready to go, they come to them and say, yeah, we ain't letting a Ukrainian benefit based on U.S. space technology. Is that kind of your take?
Pretty much one of the craziest stories I've ever seen. You got everything about Max right. Even weirder. He used to be like a OBGYN before he was a software magnate. His parents worked. Ukraine was like the backbone of the Soviet space program. His parents worked on the Soviet rockets and software, so it was kind of like in his blood. He ends up buying this bankrupt rocket maker in Texas called Firefly, and Max had this crazy vision to try to unite like the old Ukrainian Soviet space with like new American space. And it was all going well for a while. He put $250 million into Firefly, which after that might actually be more than Elon personally has put into SpaceX, and is a bit behind Jeff Bezos. But after that, Max is right there. And took years. The Firefly rocket is kind of one of those medium-sized rockets. Like, it's no joke. It took a lot of money and engineering, and they got it to the pad at Vandenberg in Southern California, where a lot of rockets launched from. And then things started to take a turn all of a sudden. I mean, Ukraine is obviously meant to be like an ally of the U.S., but the U.S. government started to have questions about a Ukrainian owning a rocket company that could fly from the United States. So they start like blocking him. They start messing with his other businesses, kind of like stopping the transfer of money from some things. And then, so I obtained all these secret documents. CFIUS is the agency that like raises these foreign ownership concerns. And I actually got the CFIUS complaint against Max. I found it pretty like hilarious and unsatisfying. There's maybe like 2 sentences about his shady business stuff, and then there's like multiple paragraphs that they essentially say like, Ukraine is near Russia. Russia is a space superpower. Max is Ukrainian. He may become a Russian asset at like some point in the future. So we do not want him to own this company. I was like, these things happen. I've covered like Huawei a lot, getting messed with by the US government because of its Chinese ownership and stuff. Unless the government has some amazing confidential information, I've never seen anything like this, to put like $250 million. They let him. It wasn't like, this went on for years. Nobody was questioning it while he was pouring money into it. It was only once the rocket was ready, they're like, oh, this was a bad idea, and we could get into it a little more if you want, but the timing on this was terrible because they sort of kick him out, and then the Ukraine war kicks off like a year later, when it would be pretty handy to have someone like Max on your side.
Well, what's fascinating to me is Elon obviously is South African, right? You've got Bezos, who's an American, but we just talked about, we've got people who are from New Zealand. We've got people from kind of all these different countries. And not only are we talking about the individuals themselves and kind of their nationalities, but also we're talking about, well, family members or, grandparents. And it's the classic, like, America is just the home of immigrants. And so, it is in one way kind of a sad story, right? That somebody came to the United States, they poured all this money into it, they built out this amazing thing. On the other hand, I guess the question is like, are there valid concerns about non-Americans owning technology that is being developed in the U.S. specifically around space? Like, what is you're the foremost expert that I would know on space at this point in terms of all these different companies, all the nuances. Like, how do you balance it in your head in terms of like maybe where the line should be drawn versus where it is today?
So I've got complicated thoughts on that. Like in the Max situation in particular, I thought it was a little ridiculous because Ukraine is an ally of the United States. Like, it would behoove us to have their engineers to set up this linkage between Ukraine and the US. There's been rumors for like decades that there's not much money anymore in the Ukrainian space program. They have very smart engineers that those guys sometimes are working for like North Korea or Iran on their ICBMs and stuff like that. And I thought, here's this guy who actually has like a plan, and he's like a man of action and means, and he's making this happen. Like the bigger question. So over the last couple of years, we've seen the U.S. government throw out a couple people like Max. There was also a Russian dude who had a space company, and he got tossed as well. And there's always been these concerns, right? Because they are like, the rockets are like ICBMs. Even Rocket Lab, Peter Beck in New Zealand, he basically had to beg the United States government to exist because they did not want another country having like an ICBM. And even though New Zealand's part of the Five Eyes, it's like our closest alliance, he had to spend like a year going to see Obama to allow Rocket Lab to happen. They had to set up a headquarters in Los Angeles. It was sort of like a fake headquarters for a while, and it's real now. But it's super complicated. I think, to me, I understand the roots of all this. I think it's like it's getting to be sort of an archaic proposition. We used to not want our aerospace secrets to fall into other people's hands. Like Peter Beck went on the internet and read a few textbooks and made the second most successful rocket company in the world from New Zealand with like no US help. So my general theory is that like, if just about anyone can do this if they really put their mind to it and are smart enough at this point. And then I make a television show called Hello World where I go all around the world interviewing scientists. I just went to like Kyrgyzstan, and they have a team of 10 women who are just college undergrads who are making the country's first satellite for like $250,000. I don't know, I just think this is like a new era, and like if we're trying to keep if our goal really is to like try to keep ICBM type technology out of the hands of some nations, I just think it's sort of pointless, at this juncture. It's like not going to happen. And the US doesn't, anyway, yeah. And China's doing just fine with their space program. I think I think these are very like Cold War kind of vibes that are still hanging around.
Now, one of the parts of the book that I think I knew this existed, but I didn't understand the extent to which it existed is there's a difference, obviously, between the rocket company and the launch pads. And there's a payment that gets made to the launch pad when it is used. But there's also a payment that gets made when it is supposed to be used. So it's kind of reserved, but not used. It's just a lower fee, right? Kind of like, hey, you wasted our time, so give us some money. But in the book, you talk about pretty much people going around the world. They're going to Hawaii. They're going to various islands. They're going to Alaska. I forget who it is, but somebody goes to India, right? And they're essentially looking for these launch pads. And some of them, it seems like, have to do with geography and kind of, a trajectory and things like that. Some have to do with cost. Some of them have to do with backlog of actual schedule and things like that. Is there an argument that the United States should just go like, create a bunch more launch pads around the coastlines of the US and like, let's just go all in on space and try to, beat all these other countries? Or is there actual value either for the United States or for these companies in having launch pads literally be, across geographies, across time zones, across countries, and that's actually a better thing?
Dude, I'm impressed. You're the first person who's like picked up on all this and the like sort of sophistication and intricacies of all these pads and everything. Yeah, I never thought about it fully like that before. The US is in some ways launchpad rich. We've got stuff in California, Virginia, Florida, and Alaska. On the other hand, most of those are quite government or NASA controlled. So Rocket Lab has a private spaceport. SpaceX has its one in Texas, which is pretty Starship focused. But other than that, it's hard to find a private spaceport. I think the US is disadvantaged to build a ton more in that I think people are going to be super worried about having like you kind of need it as close to the equator as you can get. So you want to be like Southern California, Southern Florida. Alaska's good, just like you mentioned, there's specific orbits you can get to from up there. But I think the trend on all this really, just today we saw this like old concept coming back today, which is these barges out at sea. I think a lot of this moves to like offshore, just getting totally away from people. You pump out a rocket in a factory, you put it on a boat, you send it to this barge, and then launch it out in the ocean. And obviously the U.S. would be in great shape to do something like that. And that was, we talked about Astra, this company Alameda. I mean, this is something they've been pursuing for a long time because they're right by the water. It's just you literally pop the rocket out of the factory onto this boat, and then like off it goes, maybe even the same day or the next day. I think that's probably where we're heading, is like less infrastructure instead of more.
When you think about those barges, are these like normal barges that can just be converted, or do you think they have to be kind of custom built? Obviously, I think a lot of people will think of a barge in space and they'll see, the rocket boosters come and re-land on these like drone ships in the ocean with SpaceX. Is that what we're talking about?
Like SpaceX is the only one that can land. This is more on the disposable end. And yeah, they have to be like, you have to have some infrastructure, but this is also like whatever picture, most of us have this picture in our head of like 120 people in this like NASA mission control, and everybody's got a job and they've all got the red phone and they're sweating, like Astra launches their rockets with like two people in a modified, trailer shipping container that can go anywhere around the world. And this is really where we're heading. So the barges have to have like some infrastructure to fuel the rockets and stand it up and all that stuff. But otherwise, no, man, it's just like a flat. All you need is a little flat surface and stand the thing up and shoot it.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible to kind of think about how quickly this is all playing out. I want to talk about companies like Varda as well. As you know, I'm an investor in it. But what's interesting to me is in reading the book, now I feel much more educated to talk to Delian and Will and those guys, right? And be a little dangerous.
Probably feel better about your investment, man.
Yeah, well, for sure. But if I had to segment out the industry, kind of after reading the book, it's like, okay, you have the launch pads, you also have a lot more of the kind of public stuff. Then you've got all these rocket companies, and that's really where the focus has been, right? Is how do we get these rocket companies? I think SpaceX with Starlink, they're the first ones, or one of the first ones to be like, okay, like now that we can get to space, what do we do when we're there, right? We've got obviously a couple of other companies that are trying to do things around satellites and stuff like that. Varda is trying to do manufacturing or these like space factory type things. Talk about maybe not just Varda, but like what is the cohort of companies that are going to say, all right, I don't want to worry about the rocket thing. Like I'll just hitch a ride with these folks who already figured out the rocket thing. But I want to focus on what we actually do once we get to space. I've seen, I think, Bezos and Blue Origin talk some of this as well. Like, what are you seeing there that's interesting to you, or what are some of the companies or people that I think people should pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the rockets are sexy and fun to watch, but this is like where most of the action is, and I think the money, and there's just tons more companies than rocket companies. Just super quick, this. Like we would not be having this conversation 5 years ago. I mean, this stuff is like flipped so quick, and part of it is like the industry has matured. So you used to be a rocket maker, and that was all you did. And now companies like Rocket Lab, so they make the rocket, and then they make 90% of what goes into a satellite: the electronics, the solar panels. If you're another startup, you just take your fancy camera or your scientific experiment, and you just plop that into Rocket Lab's little sort of bus. I mean, this is what Varda is doing, in fact. And, this just saves a ton of cost. It used to be like every startup used to have to do all this work, basically building the innards of a satellite for just trying to do their mission in space. Like in the book, I argue communications and imaging have been these first two major businesses, and we do have thousands upon thousands of satellites doing that, and we're going to add more. I think Varda represents like so I think they're going up next month, I think?
In June, yep.
I think it's June, yeah. So, and on that rocket, I mean, I think that rocket is like a symbol of a moment in time, because it is our first one where we're really getting to new businesses. Like everyone's always said, oh, there's imaging and communications and a little sort of fringe science for laboratories, but like what is the next business? So Varda's going to go up. They're going to make pharmaceuticals. There's Astroforge, I used to think asteroid mining was insane until I actually went to Astroforge's office for my show, and it looks it's a very talented team. It looks very real to me. They're setting up their first. They're not like mining an asteroid right away, but they're setting up their first, like prototype to see if they can burn through a sample up there and get some data off of it. And so, pretty quickly, we are now. I would broadly call it manufacturing of different stripes. And I think we're going to move industry into low Earth orbit. There's a lot of sense of putting things like data centers that can be solar powered up there. All kinds of interesting things you can do with molecules without gravity pressing on you. So I think like right at this very moment, this whole thing is kicking off in a new way. It reminds me, like, I'm old enough to sort of live through like the 1996 consumer internet, where we laid all this fiber and we're building these data centers, and everyone's like talking about killer apps all the time is annoying. But everyone's searching for like, we know there's something here, like what are people going to do? Some of the business models were maybe obvious, but nobody would have guessed like sort of what 2023 fully looks like. And we're running this huge experiment in low Earth orbit. Is like, are we having that same moment right now? And do these things check out or do they not?
I got to ask a couple of questions that I've always been obsessed with. One,
okay.
Are we going to colonize Mars in our lifetime?
People, I could not be more convinced that SpaceX is going to send rockets to Mars. It's going to send tons of stuff to Mars. When you get to like an actual human, it is awful, right? It's like a 6-month ride. You really want to believe that you get a ride back. We got to put up some sort of infrastructure to some sort of infrastructure to like let a human inhabit that. I would say when I finished the book on Elon in like 2015, I was pretty convinced that of sort of what SpaceX would do there. I'm more convinced than ever that company is like the most capable company, the most capable like arrangement of thousands of people maybe that's like ever been assembled. So I don't know if I'm ready to commit to full colonization. I am super confident we're going to send stuff to Mars, and I think probably like have some people try it out. I'm less optimistic than Elon about like how hospitable it ends up being up there.
Do you think Elon dies on Earth or on Mars?
He's always said he wants to die on Mars, man. I think if you asked him these days, he'd probably tell you like an AI was going to assassinate him before he gets up there. I'm kind of surprised he hasn't been on one of these SpaceX missions now. We just set up another batch of like private astronauts.
No, come on, keep that man on Earth, protect him at all costs. Do not let him get on any rockets.
those SpaceX, they're pretty safe, man. It's probably safer than being in a car.
I understand, but still, in the one-off chance, can you imagine the damage that would be done to the space industry if Elon Musk, something happened to him on a rocket?
And again, I'm sorry. This is really not meant to like be a fanboy sort of thing. SpaceX is just very cool. I do not think people realize how fucked the United States would be if SpaceX did not exist. Like, we just killed the space shuttle. It's like Lockheed and Boeing were doing nothing new at all. China has been pumping just billions of dollars. People would be freaking out. I laugh sometimes. Look, Elon brings a lot of grief upon himself and says some crazy things. I laugh that it's so black and white, and like I find the whole conversation sort of stupid. Sometimes it's like okay, like on some level, why do you care what anybody says? Just look at the last 20 years of what this person actually did. It sort of speaks for itself. It's also crazy to do it in 20 years. Is like, look at Blue Origin,
Yeah.
They've done okay. They have like these tourist flights. They've existed for just as long as SpaceX. Nowhere in the same ballpark.
You think like the billionaires got like a group chat and they're just like, yo, I'm starting a space company. The next one's like, me too.
Dude, if they do, Elon's crapping all over him because like Bezos and Branson have had a tough time of it. Poor Paul Allen passed away. It really hasn't gone that well for them. When does this podcast go up?
As this week.
This week. I mean, later this week, I got a story running on an exclusive story on Sergey Brin, who is not doing rockets, but you will see he's also getting in the aerospace game. There seems to be a thing, right? It's like, I guess after you've bought a mega yacht, you have to like
Of course
move up. But Elon's the only one who's turned it into a real business, you know? I think I used to not be a moon person. I was sort of like, let's just do the Mars thing. The moon is actually getting interesting now. We got like a couple, private companies working with NASA to send humans back, but then there's companies now that are like starting to think about private colonies on the moon, which is actually affordable now. They're putting private satellites around the moon. I think the moon gets pretty interesting in the next 10 years.
Couple more questions for you. We now are getting to a point where we've got like air traffic control of all these satellites, and how do we actually keep them from colliding with each other? We then get into like the whole like military industrial complex and like, can I shoot down your satellite? Can you shoot down mine? You mentioned in the book that Russia basically took out one of their own satellites as kind of a reminder, like, we have missiles that can hit these things. Is there legitimacy and like offensive or just defensive capabilities when it comes to this Space Force thing? Is there going to be like a Blackwater kind of, private, defense force that you can hire to protect your satellites? Like, what's going on in kind of the military components of this, both with the military Space Force, but also with maybe private companies trying to get into that game?
Man, that is a cool. I'm going to write a short story on that idea after this. I mean, I don't think people realize how weird shit is about to get.
Like Anduril absolutely needs space defense service.
That would be cool. I could see this. It's like on the big level, right? Everybody should be incented to not screw this up, because the second you blow somebody else's satellite up, you kind of just risk taking out your own service. So you, like, on one level, people should be rational actors. I think Russia has already, Russia is the great wild card in all this. Giant space superpower with space program collapsing, no commercial space startups at all to speak of. Like, how do they sort of handle this new world? China's like this mix of government like trying to sort of become private, and then the US is just like roaring commercial space. The like government guys are kind of laggards. I don't know how things are going to go. There's other stories in the book too, like people should know, I think it's China put up a satellite that then popped out a baby satellite that would like just hang out by American satellites, and it didn't seem to be doing anything, but it was sort of like if we wanted to shove you out of orbit, we probably could, or maybe we could hack you. So it's really strange. In the Defense Department, my God, yes, they desire the ability to like fly a rocket tomorrow to put a satellite right over whatever they want, and they're getting like close to that. So
we did it
we
did it to an asteroid, right? Didn't we send a rocket and like hit an asteroid and try to redirect the asteroid?
Yeah, we've done stuff like that, but this is like they call it responsive space. I mean, the DoD has been fantasizing. This is like Space Force all comes from this, and Pete Worden, who we talked about, is like kind of the progenitor of a lot of this. It's just treating space like another arm of the military, where like something breaks out, you mobilize your aircraft carriers, your jets, your troops, and then you start sending rockets up to do stuff. The problem is like there's things we really depend on, like GPS today, which is, you sort of take it for granted, but it's like this glue that makes your cell phone work and all kinds of transportation work. I mean, the second we screw something up in space, that we could back in time quite quickly.
All right, last question for you. Are aliens real?
This is funny, man. Okay, so Pete Worden, astrophysicist, Black Ops. If somebody should know about aliens, it's him. I've spent a lot of time with Pete. I've asked him this several times. I mean, he's actually like look for aliens. He assures me they're not. Maybe he knows and he's not telling me. If anyone was going to know, I've asked Elon too. I'm like, look, man, you're going up there more than anybody else. If aliens were going to contact someone, it's probably you. You know, Elon says he's got nothing either, so I don't know.
Do they believe that they exist, or do they just believe, hey, we haven't come in contact with them yet?
Like, Elon, I sort of get the feeling just doesn't even think about this much. Pete, he wants to explore the outer reaches of the solar system, and he's being funded by Yuri Milner right now to make like a probe that would go out of our solar. Like, Pete wants to find. I think Pete believes that he wants to find stuff. So, if
it's one of the greatest. It's one of the greatest conquests that a human could do right now. Like the person who contacts aliens. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, you go through all these things, all these inventions, all these things. Like, there's certain people in history. I think Elon for SpaceX and kind of reusable rockets, all that stuff, like he'll be remembered for literally centuries. The person who contacts aliens first, they're on the map.
I saw Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian. He tweeted yesterday, he's like, you realize there's a non-zero chance that our first contact with aliens will be a dick pic that's been forwarded out for something. But I don't know, man. If I wish I knew.
Elon will pay the aliens off in Dogecoin just for the laughs.
Can you imagine if Elon was our first contact? I don't know.
Oh my God.
I don't know if that would bode well for us or not.
He would be attacked. No one would believe him. He'd be just attacked. They'd be like, shut up. You don't know anything. You're stupid.
I think you're probably right.
All right, Ashlee, this book was fantastic. When the Heavens Went on Sale, the Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. What I love about it is you kind of build off of the work that you did in the book on Elon, but also you cover what now have become some of the most important companies in space. You've got a bunch of people in here, people who worked at NASA, people who are building these companies, but also you help explain, I think, some of the difficulties and complexities in doing this stuff, right? It's not just like, hey, raise some money from venture capitalists, go out onto this launch pad, launch the thing into space, and we all get rich. There is a ton of complexity. And one of the things that, I think people probably don't understand is when you build the first rocket, it's not supposed to actually make it to space. Right? Like if you launch a rocket and it goes to space the first time, like you are the 1 in a billion, right? It's actually, no, we're just launching it to get
only one.
Yeah, you may be the only one. And so I think the book is just does a great job, one, explaining kind of the frontiers of space and why people are doing this, but also the progress we've made to date so far. So I highly suggest people go get it. Again, When the Heavens Went on Sale, the Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. It's even got the really great photo on the front. So if you're watching this, it's worth it, I promise. Any last words from you, Ashlee? Where can we send people to find you online?
Yeah, man. We're going to make a HBO documentary about that here. We're in the process. I spell my name a little weird with 2 E's, just ashleevance.com, or at Twitter, same thing. It's just great being on with you, Pomp. I appreciate it, man.
I appreciate you taking the time, a couple years out of your life, to write the book and then letting me read it in a few hours. But we will definitely do this again in the future, and I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, man.